Welcome to Why Such a Fuss, an exciting new channel dedicated to help individuals and businesses to learn more about data protection in a way that is easy and engaging. I'm Christina from CVG Solutions, and I am a fully qualified data protection professional. I am passionate about educating, empowering, and enabling businesses to thrive. Remember to like and subscribe to this channel and help us to spread the word. Data protection is there for a reason. It protects you, your family, loved ones, customers, employees from coming to harm through the use of personal data. So make sure you click subscribe. Now, get ready to embark on a journey of growth and knowledge as we dive into the world of data protection. Today, I would like to welcome Ralf O'Brien, Global Privacy, Data Protection and Security Advisor to my channel. Hello, Ralf, and welcome.
Hello, the privilege and honor is all mine.
Fantastic. So the podcast now has reached over 50 episodes, and I think it's about time that we cover a little bit of history of data protection. As contrary to popular belief, it did not start 5 years ago. It's actually been around for 40 years. And I cannot think of a better person than you, Ralf, to give us a little bit of a history tour. So I'm going to give the micro to you if you want, and then sort of interrupt when I think there is something that we need to add to the pot. But go ahead.
Interrupt away, and thank you, Christina, for inviting me on. Where to begin is the question. I mean, when we're talking about our rights to privacy, we've had peeping Tom laws and things like that all the way back since 1400s. But in terms of modern data protection, I mean, you can really look at it in a couple of eras. The first era is what I'd call the privacy of the human right to privacy, which started after the Second World War. And then there's kind of the data protection period, which would be starting in the 70s, really, with the rise of the computer. People get them confused. People get privacy and data protection confused all the time. But in European and the UK law, privacy is really referring to our human right to privacy versus the government, whereas data protection is really looking at when organizations process our data. It was really the rise of computers, the rise of computers that gave rise to data protection law through the 70s. But we in the UK, we were a little bit behind our European counterparts. We didn't have our first data protection law till 1984, after the signing of Convention 108 in 1981.
Yeah.
And Convention 108 itself was based on the OECD report of 1980, which is where we first saw terms like data controller and principals and data subject. So really that terminology has been in place since 1980, which is 45 years ago now.
Yes. So as you know, Ralf, the aim of this podcast is to provide awareness of data protection to non-data protection people. And so I try and put myself in their shoes and ask questions that they would ask, or they might think, but they won't, might be scared to ask. So with that in mind, Ralf, what is Convention 108 and how does it differ from the Data Protection Act, that is, the 1998 or the 2018 Act? What's the difference?
A lot come down to who authored it and why, really. So the OECD report, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In the late 70s, they basically realized that lots of different countries were coming up with data protection laws. And that was quite a bad thing in a way, because it meant that data couldn't move properly because all the laws were different. So the idea of the OECD report was to kind of come up with a load of principles where if you were passing your national law, you could make it look roughly the same as the others. And that's why those principles we see, all the way through to the GDPR in 2016, purpose, transparency, accountability, quality, accuracy, they're all there from that OECD report. So what the Convention 108 then did a little bit later on, that was from an organization called the Council of Europe, not the EU, very different organization in the EU. Council of Europe has got about 49 member states, about 47 now. They kicked Russia out quite recently. And the UK is still a member of the Council of Europe,
Yes.
even though we and so the Council of Europe runs the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which
Yeah.
you can take your government to court for privacy law. And they came up with this convention in 1918 that said, look, if you are processing data on computers and you are going to create a national law, do it in accordance with these principles. And so when the UK came up with their first Data Protection Act in 1984, it was really only about computers and really just about implementing these principles that actually we still have today. So you could argue the OECD and the Convention 108 are some of the most important historic data protection documents
Yes.
we've got, because we
Because
still follow the
it's
principles
still,
today.
like you say, it's still influencing recent laws.
Yeah.
So okay, so obviously we got Convention 108, and then in the 90s, each member state then created their own Data Protection Act.
Mm.
So why was there the need to then bring the GDPR?
Okay, well, I'll take you back one more step.
All right, yeah, good.
That's the reward.
I'm jumping ahead, Ralph.
It's fine. When we had our 1984 Act, we weren't even a member of the EU, really, as the EU didn't really even exist. I mean, we had its predecessor, the coal and steel community and things like that. But the EU, this sort of group of this European superstate, this didn't really exist till the Maastricht Treaty of 1991, 1992. So we didn't have an EU. So we actually had a Data Protection Act for ourselves in the UK before the EU really existed. But when the EU did exist in the 90s, they came up with the 95 directive. And the 95 directive was really to say to the European member states, look, if you want to be a member of this club, it's sans frontière, without borders. Now, people's political opinions may, you may feel that we like borders. You may feel like we don't like the freedom of movement that the EU wanted to guarantee. But at the time, 95, we
Yeah.
were a member state, and therefore, we believed in freedom of movement. And obviously, if you move, your data moves with you. So one of the purposes of the 95 Data Protection Directive was to basically say, if you want to be an EU member state, you've got to have a data protection law so that people can move and their data can move without friction. If everyone follows the same law, then people can move in freedom. And so when it seems weird to think about data protection laws as something that allow data movement, but the idea of data protection law was literally that, so that everybody in the club could move around in freedom without any friction caused by differing laws. And then moving forward to the GDPR, so that's 1995. But obviously the world changed. I mean, you consider the world back in 1995, and the 95 law, by the way, brought in manual processing as well, not just computerized processing. So we answered that in the UK with our 1998 Data Protection Act. So we then got our next upgrade. So it was 84 Act to 95 Directive to 98 Act locally. And then, of course, the GDPR arrived. Now, why did the GDPR arrive? Well, again, two things. One, we wanted to move it from a directive to a regulation, sort of a much stronger law. And what that basically meant was, even under the 95 directive, individual countries were kind of free to go their own way a little bit. They had the same principles, but they could find people in different ways. Some had DPOs, some didn't. Some countries you had to register, some countries didn't. Now imagine being a global multinational like, I don't know, Facebook or Apple or someone like that, and you're dealing with 30 different regulators with similar laws, and it's a real pain in the ass. So one of the promises of the GDPR was to kind of create this one-stop shop. Yeah, they talked about the one-stop shop, which was this idea that you would have a single lead regulator and the laws would be exactly the same wherever you are. And that was really and at the same time, they wanted to upgrade the GDPR or upgrade the data protection laws to increase the level of fines and penalties and increase the amount of rights individual has as we moved into the digital age. When you think about 95 to 2016, when the
Yeah.
GDPR was passed, there's a huge difference in technology and culture. And, back in 95, I didn't have a mobile phone or an email address, right?
True, true. Yes.
2016, we're talking about cloud computing. So huge difference in data and culture. And so the idea of the GDPR was to update the laws for the digital age. And some would argue they're still not there yet, right? Some would argue they're still not yet. And then I mean the next change, realistically is then from GDPR to Brexit. So when we left the EU, we then had to go through a whole change of law again. So some really interesting sort of developments as you can trace data protection law back to its roots in privacy all the way up through to the modern day.
Yes. And one last question, Ralf, if you don't mind, again, for the purpose of or for the benefit of our audience, what is the difference between a directive and a regulation?
Okay, well, it's just for those European law scholars out there, basically the EU can pass two different types of law. The EU can pass a directive and a regulation. And a directive, if you like, is a lesser law. So you do have to reply as a EU member state if they pass a directive in Brussels, if the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council get together and they do something called the trilogue, where they have a chat, and if they sign that into law, the directive is passed. And you, as a member state, you kind of have got to pass a law, but it's kind of got to be in the spirit of the directive. You can make your own changes. So a directive is kind of instructive. You've got to do something. You've got to pass a law that sort of complies with the spirit of the directive.
Okay.
But it's kind of up to you how you implement it. A regulation is far stronger. You pass a regulation at a good example of one that's actually still in play would be the privacy directive. So the privacy directive was passed in 2002. We were still a member state back then, and we passed our PECR, PECA, our PECR, our marketing law in 2003 as a result. And actually, you look around the member states of Europe, and some of the opt-in and opt-out rules are quite different because it's only a directive, not a regulation.
Yes.
And then you look at the GDPR, and the GDPR as a regulation has what we call direct effect. And direct effect basically means if you're a member state, it comes into your law no matter what. Even if you don't pass your own national law, the GDPR would become your law, right? So it's got what's called direct effect. Now, we still pass our own law. So we passed the 2018 Data Protection Act. Why did we do that? Is because there are some places in the GDPR that sort of says member states can do something different, but you're only allowed to change the GDPR as a regulation where the regulation says that you can. Good example would be age of consent for an information society service. In the GDPR, it says, hey, if you're relying on consent and you want a child to use an online service, you can use parental consent up until that child is 16. Then they can consent for themselves. That's what it says in the GDPR. But then underneath it says, however, member states can pass their own laws that says that consent can be as low as 13. And in the UK, that's obviously what we did. We chose in our UK Data Protection Act Part 2 to amend the GDPR to make it 13, essentially, right?
So now
so
that
GDPR,
now that the UK is no longer part of EU, as a member state, so that means that we don't have to comply or to respond to any directive. We can just do our own thing. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, we can do our own thing going forwards, but obviously there's a huge body of our law that we have kept from our European days. So a good way to think about it is, we still have the GDPR, and that is because, we haven't passed a law that says different. We can feel free to do that now as a non-member state.
Yes.
But when we were in, what we actually did is we passed another law, would you believe, called the Data Protection and Privacy Electronic Communication EU Exit Amendment Regulations in 2019 and 2020. Two different laws. And they kind of add to the GDPR. They create this kind of UK version of the GDPR. So we actually technically in the UK don't follow the EU GDPR anymore. We follow the UK GDPR, which is this sort of track changes document. If you want to look for it online, the best way to do that to your audience is to look for something called a Keeling schedule. Mr. Keeling, Keeling, Mr. Keeling was an MP who basically said, look, if you're going to pass a law that changes another law, don't just give me the law that says change paragraph 3 like this, change paragraph 4 like this. Give me a track changes document. Give me a document that shows all the changes. And we call that a Keeling schedule. So if you look online for what's known as the UK GDPR or the Keeling schedule for the UK GDPR, it will show you all of the changes that was made to change the EU GDPR into the UK GDPR. And that's because a lot of it wasn't relevant after Brexit. Like, for example, it talks about the European Data Protection Board. Doesn't apply to us anymore. Cross it out. It talks about every member state must create a regulator. Well, we've already got the ICO. Cross that out. It's in our data protection. It talks about, again, it talks about the age of consent for children being 16 for an online service.
But also the one-stop shop doesn't apply to us anymore either.
So whereas the EU GDPR has like 99 articles, I think ours is like 77 once you've sort
68, I think.
68, there you go, 68, there you go. By the time you've crossed them all out. And that's without all the other little track changes. Like, for example, they went through and literally every time it said member state, cross that out, right, domestic law, or every time it said, EU supervisory body, cross that out, right, ICO, the commissioner. So a lot of it was housekeeping, a lot of it was admin, but it is worth knowing because if you're processing data before the 31st of January, the 31st of December 2019, you'd be subject to the EU GDPR. If you're processing data after the 1st of January 2020, you'd be subject to the UK GDPR. And actually, there are enough subtle differences in there that somebody could trip up. I always say if you only know the EU GDPR, you probably know enough to be dangerous. And that's without all the amendments that we made on top of that as well, right? Yes. So I always say, whatever any person tells you in data protection, go and read the law, but go and read the right law.
Yes. Absolutely. Ralf, thank you ever so much for joining us on today's podcast. Would you be kind to let our audience know how they can get in touch with you?
Oh, I'm a very private man. They don't want to do that. No, I'm joking. You can find me on LinkedIn as r_t_O'Brien. So don't type in Ralf, it's r_t_O'Brien. You can find me on Twitter sometimes at IGR O'Brien, or r_O'Brien at rainbowconsulting.com. Happy to have a conversation.
Fantastic. Excellent. If you like this video, please give it a thumb up and remember to click on the subscribe or follow button. If you would like to get in touch with me, I can be found on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. Just search for CVG Solutions. Alternatively, email me at info@cvgsolutions.co.uk.